second part of the strategic planning program being delivered on behalf of Kerry PPN and funded by the Wheel under the Train Links program. So last week we looked at the whole area of basically needs analysis, kind of researching in terms of what you need to look, I suppose, in terms of reviewing where you are as an organization, reviewing what you've done in the past and looking at what you want to do in the future. So it was all about identifying what the priorities were for next year, if you're looking at planning for 2022, or if you're doing a longer term 3 or 5 year strategic plan, what are the key priorities you want to focus on, and what are the actions within out of those priorities that you need to work on over next while. So it was very much based on kind of gathering the data, doing the needs analysis, doing the reviews, identifying what the issues were, what the problems were, and where you could build on your strengths. So when we work with companies or organizations or groups on the strategic planning, what we do is the first phase is gathering all that data and information, and then using that information and using the analysis to make decisions as to what the group wants to do going forward. So we would normally have like a planning session with them in terms of agreeing what the priorities are, agreeing what their key objectives are over a period of time, and then basically working out an action plan as how they can best develop those objectives and implement their projects and strategies. So after last week's workshop, Eamon and Caroline emailed out to you a strategic planning template, a Word document that we use, which is basic. It's a very basic template, but it's pretty much does what it does in terms of gives you a good basis to put something together if you're writing your strategic plan. And it covers all the bases in terms of what you need to have included in your plan as well. As I said, if you have any questions on that template, my email is on the template also, so feel free to email me any questions you might have. If you're struggling with parts of it, or if you're not too sure what to put in terms of content, or if you put in too much or too little, feel free to bounce ideas off me or ask me some questions. If you want me to review your plans as well, you can send them on to me and I can quick look over them and just give you some direction towards that as well, or towards improving them if they need improvement. Also on that email was a action planning template, which is basically an Excel spreadsheet that I use. And the reason I use Excel is because I tend to, if I'm working with a group on a project development and we put an action plan together, I like to use Excel because I can use it as a monitoring tool or a management tool to help me manage the project and kind of keep an eye on what's happening, what's not happening, what's progressing, what's not progressing. But you can also assign people to different actions as well, and you can also put in budgets in that action plan template. So that's why I use Excel, because it's easier sometimes than a Word document. But you can use a Word template if you want, or you can just use simple pen and paper or a flip chart or wall planner or whatever you want to do. But it's this template that I use, and it's useful because you could have a spreadsheet for different projects. So on your Excel, you could have different tabs for different projects. So it's easier to kind of manage all your projects if you've got a number of projects going at any one time, which you might have. So you might have a fundraising project, you might have a capital project, you might have just, your general kind of actions that you're developing on an ongoing basis. So it's just an easier way to manage things and to plan going forward. So there's 2 templates that I use that I've emailed out to you. So again, if you have any questions on those, feel free to ask me this evening, or if you want, email me when you get more time to review them. So I was going to share the screen with you now and the presentation. Okay, can everyone see that? Yeah, okay, great. Just put on the presentation mode here. Okay, very good. So as I was saying, the last slide we finished up on last week was this slide. So it's looking at setting your strategic priorities. So as I said, we gather all the data and then we work with the group kind of in a planning session to say, okay, what are the priorities now over next 12 months? And then all that we start setting some objectives. So the key thing with any objective is that there has to be a reason for it. Again, a lot of organizations I work with, a lot of times you come up with kind of, they want to do different things and they want to, we do this and we do that and we'll go out there and we'll start this or start that. And I always ask the question, why are you doing it? Is it going to impact on what you do on a day-to-day basis? Is it needed? Has that need been identified? is going to impact on your resources. So it's going to add more pressure on what's already probably very tight resources in terms of finance, in terms of human resources. Will it have an impact in terms of locally on the people it's supposed to, to support and help? In other words, is it worthwhile doing? And if it's not, then I always question why go ahead and do it. So as an outsider, I can be fairly blunt, and I can act as that kind of objective kind of person that's going to come in and say, look, tell me why you want to do this. Tell me, what's the reason behind it. That's really, really important, because sometimes, a few people might have an idea that this is going to be a really good idea and something we should do and drive on with. And they might bring the whole organization with them. And they kind of, they all think it's a good idea at that point. There has to be reason for it, and it has to be based on, it has to be, linked to your overall strategy in terms of what you're trying to do and trying to achieve. And it also has to be practical in terms of that you can actually do what you say you're going to do. So in a lot of cases, when groups are looking for grants, for example, they might hear of a grant application that's been announced, or a funding source that might be announced. And they say, okay, we've heard that this funding is available. And what they'll tend to do is they'll try to fit a project into their overall structure just to avail of that grant. And that's the difficulty that I have a problem with, because you always have a situation there is where you're adding a layer onto your organization that you don't necessarily need. And yes, you might get funding for it on a one-off basis, but once that funding's gone, you now have to keep this this project going and keep it maintained and keep it operational, and that's going to create more problems and you need more resources to fund that after the initial funding period's gone. So if you're looking at developing projects, again, work out why are we doing it and is there a reason behind it. Your needs analysis that you would have done based on what we discussed last week would have identified those those needs, and that might be the reason you're developing a project. But it has to be based on something. It can't be just like, someone has an idea one night and thought this would be a great idea, let's run with it. Or you see another organization doing something similar and you thought, well, if they're doing it, we can do it, and you just run with it. It has to be based on your analysis. And that's really important for not-for-profit organizations. It's obviously important for private companies and for commercial companies also. They don't just develop products and services and go off and try to do things without it impacting on the bottom line, or generating some sort of profit or revenue. Like, they wouldn't do it unless it was going to be viable. So a lot of what we do is we look at the projects and say, are they viable? Are they sustainable? And if they're not, just don't do it. So once you can decide objectives and say, okay, we need to do this because something we have to do, then you look at, okay, well, what actions do we need to do to achieve this objective? So what are the steps we need to follow? And sometimes groups kind of find, that some projects are very, very big and they're overwhelming, and they kind of panic because they're such big projects. What we always try to do is break those projects down into smaller kind of manageable actions. So, you take a large scale project and you break it down to small kind of mini projects. And when you've all the mini projects completed and all the actions associated with those projects completed, you all of a sudden have your overall project completed. Whereas you look at something head on and say, okay, we need to do all this, it just becomes overwhelming. So you break it down to smaller tasks and actions. And that's, anyone that's going to be involved in project management or is involved in managing projects in the past, whether it be in private sector or public sector or community volunteer sector, that's the way you break it down. You break it down to actions, you delegate, and all those bits and pieces come together to form the overall project. So make sure that you've actions assigned to each objective. And then what's the desired outcome? So what's kind of the outcome you want to see at the end of this process? So if you're developing a project, whatever it is, and you're out there and say, okay, we want to develop this, we know what we want to do, we know what actions we need to implement to get it off the ground. What's the outcome at the very end of it, and what difference will that outcome make? So we talk about performance indicators. We talk about what's the outcome here, what's the result here at the very end that we want to see, and then we try to measure that impact as well. So it's very important that when you're looking to secure funding for projects, that you look beyond the actual project and say, okay, what's the impact of this project going to be? So there's three kind of areas we focus on in terms of impact. One would be the social impact in terms of what the impact is on the ground to the people you're supporting and helping. So, how many people benefit from this project? How will they benefit from that project? We also look at the indirect impact. So if a person is benefiting from a specific service, so it might be cancer support, it might be childcare, it might be disability service, whatever it might be, how is the other people in that person's life their siblings, their parents, their carers, their partners, whoever it might be. How are they benefiting also indirectly from the service being provided? So we always talked about rural transport. Over the years when we're involved in rural transport projects, we looked at the direct impact of the rural transport services on the people on the bus, so the passengers that were getting from their village into the local town. And we then looked at the indirect impact in terms of how that benefits the wider community. So, for example, if a person was unable to drive, had no access to public transport, and the only way of getting into the nearest town was by some sort of form of public transport, by providing a rural transport service, you created that opportunity for that person. Now, on a value for money basis, it wasn't really value for money because it might be only 5 people on a bus. So in terms of passenger numbers, there wasn't a huge impact in terms of a return, but the social impact was huge. So we looked at things like, if a person was able to get into a day service, a daycare service, 1 day a week, just for a meal, socialization, playing a game of cards, maybe getting to see a public health nurse or whatever it might be. If that person wasn't able to go into that daycare center 1 day a week, they more likely would end up in long-term care, which would cost much more than it would if they then just providing the service, get them into daycare 1 day a week. So we looked at not just the direct impact to the person, but the wider indirect impact. And that's very, very important, especially within community voluntary projects, that you don't just look at, especially in rural areas where the population numbers just doesn't justify things in a lot of cases. You look at the direct impact and the wider indirect impact. So it's very, very important. The second impact we look at is the economic impact. Now, in a lot of cases, there won't be any economic impact because it's not an economic-based project, so there's no return, there's no revenue being generated. But in some cases, you might be developing projects where you are generating some revenue. So it might be a social enterprise project where you're actually selling a service or facilities or products or whatever it might be. So like, take, for example, a community centre might be renting out remote workspace. It might be renting out the hall for sports. It might be renting out meeting rooms. It might have a kind of a community cafe built into it. It might have a community cooperative art gallery, crafts workshop built into it. That generates some sort of revenue. It also creates jobs. So your project could actually drive some sort of economic return as well. And then the third one we look at, and it's becoming very more important with a lot of projects, and will be more important going forward, is the environmental impact. So how does your project impact on the environment? In some cases, it mightn't have any impact whatsoever on the environment because there's nothing to do with anything in terms of renewable energies or anything like that. But if you're looking at, say, developing a building project, focus on how your building is going to be more efficient, focus on how your building is going to be using alternative energy sources, that you put in car charging points, all these sort of things to show how your project is going to actually benefit the environment in whatever way it might be. So again, these are things we look at in terms of impact. So the 3 things we look at always is the reason behind it, prove that there's a need for it and that it's viable, then split the project into actions, and then look at the impact in terms of what the desired outcome is. So just on that, on the template I sent you out, the action plan template, this is a blank template. And it's something really important to use from a planning point of view, but also from a management point of view when you're managing your projects. So, and we would use the same template for private businesses that we work with in terms of what are they trying to do, what are the actions. Now, the responsibility in some cases might be one person if it's a private business, and then the resources required. So if you're talking about, say, community and voluntary organization, the priority might be to drive numbers in terms of membership, or to increase our services by 20% over the next 12 months, right? That might be the key priority. And then you break that down as an objective, okay? So each objective has to have a number of actions. So you say, okay, what are the actions involved? And I'll go through an example in a second. We're just going through the headings first of all. So the action is really the most important thing. It's where you're sitting down, logically thinking, what are the steps we need to take to make this happen, okay? And it's all about doing it logically. So for example, certain things you have to do before you can do the next step. So we often look at, say, building projects, and you'll see on their actions that they're going for procurement for builders to get quotations before their planning permission. So you're like, well, the planning permission has to come first, but before planning permission, you need a set of drawings. Who's going to do a set of drawings? So you just basically just kind of allocate or reprioritize the various actions based on a common sense approach to it, because you have to do certain steps to get to the next steps. Then the responsibility, and this is really important for groups, because what you don't want is one person responsible for everything, because that's burnout, that's overload, that's just way too much responsibility for one person, especially on larger scale projects. So you want to split that responsibility out. You want to delegate, okay? Now, key part of delegation is that you delegate responsibility to people who are capable of doing the action that you're delegating to do. So you ask them, what kind of area do you want to get involved in? What areas can you bring some skills and experience to? Where can we best utilize those skills and experience? Okay, because otherwise you're going to have someone that's going to be responsible for something, they have no idea what they're doing. It just won't happen. Okay, so if I'm working for a company and you have an accounts department, a marketing department, and a production department, you don't have the guys working in production doing the social media campaign. You don't have the social media people in the marketing department, responsible for production ordering and working on a production line. You got skill sets that people, within an organization have. So, for example, the project I'm working on at the moment on a voluntary capacity is with our soccer club. They know my skills are in the area of grant supports and getting grants. So that's what I'm doing. I'm not involved in the fundraising on any other element of the fundraising. I'm not involved in anything else, only helping them write grants. That's it. So when the grant comes up, the person responsible for getting the grant application in is Tom O'Leary. Okay. We have a meeting it's once a month now, maybe more often when required. And at that meeting, right, Tom, how's the grant application going? And we give an update. The next person is responsible for fundraising. The other person is responsible for organising the golf classic, all these things, but there's a person responsible and they're accountable for it. Okay, and that's really important because if no one's accountable and responsible, nothing gets happened or nothing happens. Is there resources required? So is there a cost for each action? And more often than not, there is. So you have to put a budget on that. So you can say, well, how much going to, for example, if you're going for planning permission, how much is that going to cost? You can't just guess it. You got to start making calls to architects and say, okay, if we're doing, hypothetically, we're doing a planning application for a project of X amount of square feet, roughly how much would that cost? You come back and you put it in here in terms of the budget required. Next question is, okay, where is that money going to come from? Do we have that money in the account to pay for it? We don't. How do we get it? Can we get a grant for that? Do we have to fundraise for it? Is there any way of getting it? If there's not, then this action doesn't happen. Okay. And then you set a deadline. Okay. So the deadline is really important as well, because you don't set deadlines, it won't happen. The laws get pushed out and pushed out and pushed out and pushed out. Okay. So deadlines are really important because it puts you under pressure to get certain things done by certain dates. Many of those deadlines are going to be enforced on you by funding deadlines. So if you've got a grant application to be in by a certain date, you can't really mess around that deadline. That's the kind of the stone wall deadline that you can't go beyond. So you can't say, well, look, I didn't realize it was, the deadline was the 1st of January or whatever. It's going to be written into your action plan. So there's no excuses for missing it. And then the performance indicator, okay, how do we know we've achieved this? Right. So again, you say, you mark that down. Let's say if you've targeted, so we're doing work with a sports club, another sports club above in America at the moment, and they want to increase participation in sport by with girls in the local community. So one of their performance indicators is that they want to see by the end of 2022 a minimum increase of 25% in girls joining the underage academy. Okay, so that's their target, right? So they work backwards and then plan and say, okay, how are we going to actually achieve that target? And that's when they start the actions in place. So their actions would be in things like working with the local schools, sending in some of the senior ladies, rugby players, into the schools as mentors and support them through their PE classes and do some coaching with them. Do a social media campaign about successful women in sport in terms of how they got involved in the sport and how it's helped them with their fitness, helped them with their careers, their social lives, their confidence, all these different things. And these are all actions that they've come up with by saying, how can we get girls involved in sport? And then it's okay, well, who's responsible for that? What do we need in terms of resources? And again, so they've worked out this action plan, just thinking logically in terms of what they need to do to hit their targets. So that's the blank template. You can add in more columns here if you want. You can put in, budgets if you want. Say, okay, we've got a budget in place here. Put in actual versus kind of a budget, projected budget versus actual budget. You can add in as many columns as you want to add in here. Some people will put in terms of responsibility. They say the person responsible and then supported by. So, for example, in a lot of cases, you might be supported by a development agency like NEWKD or Salt Kerry Development Partnership, or you might be supported by someone within the funding agency or someone within Kerry County Council, or someone external that might support you on a specific action. So again, it's just use this as a template to put as much detail as you possibly can here, because it'll help you plan. And it'll also help you go back over time in terms of each meeting. Have we achieved what we're supposed to achieve here? So it's a really useful tool. The reason I use Excel is because you can put in as many columns as you want, and you can add more and more to it, and you can link it to other files and whatever as well. So it's a good way of doing it. You can also download some action planning templates or project management software. I'm not a huge lover of downloading project management software or any kind of software. You have to learn how to use it. I spend more time trying to figure out how to use it than you do actually using it. So I just like to keep things simple Word templates, Excel templates, good old-fashioned, A3 paper and a marker and a bottle of wine helps as well, if you want to do it that way. Okay, so the example that I've just given you here is a random kind of example, but basically one of the objectives was to increase the capacity within the community centre by the end of 2023. Okay, actually that should be in 2022. So the actions there would be, well, first of all, this group would have to go off and look at, doing a feasibility study and getting some design work done on their building that they want to extend. So the action is to secure funding to carry out a feasibility study and design. The responsibility, so in this case, they would be advised to set up a building project committee with maybe 4 people or 5 people that would be responsible for this project. They would identify a consultant to go to ask them in terms of roughly how much will this cost, how we pursue it, how we progress with it, or they would go to one of the development officers in local development company and say, look, we're looking to do something like this. What have you done? What have you funded in the past? Who's out there that does this work? What consultants are out there in the marketplace that we can target and we can go to for tenders. So what they would then come back with and say, okay, well, we've made a few calls to some consultants, we've made a few calls to local development companies, we've made some calls to other community volunteer organizations who've done something similar, and they said the budget is in around 10,000 euros, for example. Okay, they know that if they go for leader funding to do that, they'll get 90% funding to do the study, and 10% of that they'll have to come up with themselves. Okay. They'll also have to come up with bridging funding to bridge the entire cost, pay for the money up front, and then look to reclaim the grant that they've been approved for. So the key thing there for them is when the next deadline will be, right? So let's say the next grant deadline is January 2022. Okay, so they'll be in the position at the moment of putting that application together. So it goes into the next assessment committee meeting, which will be January 2022. Let's say that these group don't really have their act together and they're not really well organized, and they miss this deadline, then they'll be probably waiting until maybe March 2022 to get the application. So now they've pushed their project up by 2 months. But within publicly funded projects, pushing a project up by 2 months is really pushing a project up by about 9 months, based on the way things work in terms of assessments and everything else. So just by being unorganized, you have a situation there now where they push their project out and they probably missed a deadline for windows for funding maybe mid next year. So that's why it's really important to to put things down on an action plan and think through in terms of when we need certain things done, because these are really important things to do when you're planning any project. Okay, if you're a private company, these things aren't really relevant because you're funding these projects out of your own reserves and your own finances. So you're not reliant on public funds when they're released, when they're announced, any sort of assessment process, any sort of delay in assessment, or any sort of delay in drawdown. So in other words, with private companies, you can turn projects around very, very quickly because you're doing everything yourself on your own. Whereas if you're doing projects that are publicly funded, you are going to be limited based on the timeframes that are imposed on you by external people. If you are not up to or not keeping on track in terms of getting things in time, it just shows projects way out in terms of timeframes, which can be disaster in a lot of cases. So let's say the performance indicator in this case would be the grant is applied for and approved. So at the end of this process for the first action within this action plan, the group will sit down and say, okay, well, we got the funding approved. We can now hit the ground and move on to phase 2, right? So phase 2 will be the next action is complete the study, get the designs drawn up, get some costings done. Again, the building project is still responsible, but now they have a consultant that's working with them, and they're responsible for getting these elements done. The committee's job is to oversee it. The funding is the same as well as up here. The funding source is the same as well as up here. And then they put a deadline. So they tell the consultant, we're giving you a deadline of 3 months to get this work done, because we want to go for planning permission at the end of this process, and that'll take 3 months. We want our planning in place by the end of the year. Okay, so again, very thought out. When should we do this? When's the best time to get this thing in track? The next phase of that project will be secure funding. So let's say planning has been approved. Now they got to secure funding for the construction. Again, the building project is in place, but now they get the fundraising committee involved as well. There's more people now involved because now you need to get money for the building project, for the construction. So there's a lot more money involved. The construction costs, we don't know yet because they're not being there. They'll only be known after this process. Potential source of funding, again, they would have looked at with the consultant where potentially can we get this funding from. Again, there are your funding sources here. The deadlines, again, unknown at this point until they're released, and then the funding secured. That's the indicator. So using this template, this action plan, they will revert back to this time and time again, because once they know once they know the construction costs, they'll just input the construction costs in here. Once knowing that the grant deadlines are up, they'll input the deadlines within the grant here. So these action plan templates they're livable documents. They're living documents. They're constantly updated as things change. Okay, and that's why they're very important planning tool for organizations. What we try to recommend is if you're having, well, most meetings are on Zoom, but if you're having, say, Zoom meetings with your committees, or you're having face-to-face meetings with committees, we would normally kind of recommend that you have this template on a screen and you're actually filling the template with everyone's consultation, with everyone's kind of viewpoints being taken on board, or someone's just writing it down. So this kind of sounds like kind of paint by numbers, but it's really important that if you just follow these simple steps, it just makes your life so much easier when you're planning your projects and you're managing your projects. Okay, a lot of people spend time focusing on writing a strategic plan, and it looks fantastic, but it's of no use to you whatsoever because this template isn't done properly. So you might have an action plan template, but it's got no deadlines, it's got no resources, it's got no responsibilities. It's basically a nice looking plan then, it doesn't do much more than that. This is really a practical document that you're going to be using for everything. Let's say they have another objective then that they want to focus on next year, and that might be to increase their volunteer base and to recruit new volunteer directors. So the action is to identify key people with key skills within the community that they're going to encourage to join the board or get involved in committees or get involved in different project teams or whatever it might be. So again, the responsibility of that, well, that might be the coordinator, if there's a coordinator or manager in place, the board, because ultimately they're going to be recruiting a person, and they're the ones that are connected to the wider community anyway. So they'd be asked to get involved in recruiting new volunteer directors. The resources required, unless they're paying a director off, they basically have no resources. In terms of financial resources, is purely time. So who's got the time to go out there and find these people? The source of funding is not applicable because there's no funding required. And then you set a deadline. It's really important because with the other one, the deadlines are kind of, the first action there, the first objective there, the deadlines are kind of enforced on you by external bodies. With this, you're setting a deadline for the organization to go out there and achieve certain things by certain dates, okay? And let's say the target here is to bring in 2 new voluntary directors, have them recruited by March of next year, okay? So what I would do, if I was sitting on a board, I'd be saying, okay, right, let's say 5 people on a board, or 7 people on the board. Every one of those people would be asked, do you know anyone with the following skills? Whether you know them personally, they're involved in, play golf with them, or they're involved in a club with you, or you know them through family member, or they're related to you, or they're a work colleague, or whoever they are. Can you list 5 people that you know that you can approach? Okay. And everyone knows someone, right? Unless they literally don't get out. And if they don't get out, they're probably not going to sit on the board in the first place. They're probably well connected, whether it be professionally, socially, through their family, whatever it might be. And they just go and ask someone, look, we want you to get involved in a specific project. We want to get you, involved in a committee. We're not going to ask you to go to loads of meetings. We're not going to ask you to sign up as director. We just want to get you involved because, we know you've got certain skills and experience that would be relevant to us. Some would say no time, family commitments, too busy as it is, volunteering as it is, that's all fine. But if you've got, say, 7 people targeting 10 people, that's 70 people have been targeted, and all those 70 people want 2 people. Okay, so you're basically spreading the workload. You go out there and saying, okay, all of you talk to as many people as you possibly can. Okay, but you're giving them a very clear, specific kind of criteria in terms of who you're headhunting. So it's not just saying like, I know someone that's really bored, just retired, and they want to get involved in something. That's of no use to you. and no offense to the person that is fictional person I'm talking about, but you want someone that's going to bring certain skills and experience to the table here that can actually assist you with certain projects you're going to developing. And that's really, really important. So there's a deadline set for it. So if there's no deadline set for it, the next meeting, you talk to them, no, I didn't get a chance now this month to talk to anyone, but okay, I will next month. That kind of carry on. And you're into, June, July, and there's still no one involved. And then you're into the summertime and nothing happens in summertime, now into September, October, and you're still looking for new directors. So just focus on it and make it, important that if we're going to do something here, let's set time frames on it, and let's delegate it to certain people. Really important. So that's a simple action plan template that, as I said, we use for planning our objectives and our actions, and all these actions are part of the wider objectives, which tie into your overall strategy. Okay, so we talked about last week was we've identified an issue in our community, we've identified an issue with our people we're supporting. We need to do X, Y, and Z. So our focus for next year is to get this off the ground. How do we do it? And that's where you sit down and work, sensibly, practically looking at how we're going to get this action off the ground and how we're going to do this, how we're going to fund it. Okay, rather than what a lot of people do is they'll come up with an idea and they'll just jump straight in, right? All guns blazing, and it's just a mess. It might happen, but it'll be the most inefficient, probably very frustrating process for everyone involved, because they just didn't break it down into actions and have every action well thought out. So like when we talk to groups about developing large scale projects, which a lot of them are doing, they all kind of go, "Jesus, there's no way in the world we can do this. There's not a hope we can do this. It's too big." So we say, yeah, that's the big project. Let's break down to small things first, and then over time they'll start achieving the larger project. But it's breaking down to step one, step 2, step 3, step 4, where a lot of groups want to go to step 10. And jump straight to step 10, but if that happens, then you've missed out on the first 9 steps, and something's going to go wrong. So again, just use a simple template, and it is a simple template for going forward yourselves for your action planning. Whether you're writing a strategic plan or not, even simply as a pure action plan for next year, whether you're not for profit or for a profit company, this action plan will help you focus what you need to do for 2022. Okay, so once you have an action plan in place, right? So you've got your strategy in terms of what we're trying to do. We have our objectives set out. We have our action plan. It looks fantastic. We've color coded. We've looking really, really well. It's only ink on paper unless you implement it. Okay, and this is the really important part, because as I said to you last week, I'm kind of sick of working with groups where you spend a lot of time and effort and energy, and they spend a lot of money and time and effort and energy on writing a plan for a project or for a community, and no one implements it. No one does anything with it. It's really frustrating. I don't like driving through villages where I did a plan maybe 5-6 years ago, and I'm still looking at the exact same thing that was there 5-6 years ago. I love driving through villages and towns where I'm looking at stuff and I can say to my kids in the back of the car, I was involved in that project, I was involved in that project, I was involved in that, because they've done something with it. And it's kind of heartwarming and it actually makes your job more kind of rewarding when you actually see people implementing actions that you helped them develop, or objectives help develop. But it's very, very frustrating and disheartening, even though we're paid for doing it, where people just take a document you prepared and do nothing with it. Okay, and the reason they do nothing with it, not because they don't want to do anything with it, it's because they don't have the structures in place to implement it. So key part of what we do with our strategic plan, at the end of every strategic plan or feasibility study that we write, we have a section on implementation. How are this group going to implement this project? Okay, and what we're really showing them is we're showing them the map in terms of where they need to go, but we're also kind of giving them step-by-step directions in terms of how to actually drive there and get there. Okay, so unless they're completely ignoring what they've been recommended to do, they should be okay in terms of getting everything in place. So it's really important in terms of everything you do, every decision you make, every action you come up with on paper has to be implemented. Otherwise, it just doesn't happen. So the key thing we look at is the structures. Have you got the right structures in place to actually implement this project? Have you got committee structures in place that are going to be delegated to do certain pieces of work? Do you require staffing, like to be paid staff or volunteer staff? And what are the resources that you require to do it? Okay. So an awful lot of very good projects that we have seen over the years, mostly building projects that cost an awful lot of money, on paper look like would be fantastic projects. But the problems normally would be that the funding that's required to develop the projects is just not achievable. They won't ever get to the level of funding they require. So the project is scrapped. They might be able to get to the level of funding that's required, but they just don't have the structures in place to manage that sort of level of project or manage that level of funding. And they can't convince the funders that they're the best structure in the world, or organization in the world to implement this project. So it doesn't happen. They might have the structure in terms of the overall governance structure in place. They might have access to funding, but they know in their heart and soul they just don't have the resources on the ground to actually deliver on the project. Okay, so they won't develop it. Whereas other groups, they'll ignore all that. They'll go straight to the funding, draw down the funding, and then halfway through the process, they realize, what are we after doing here? You know, we've taken on way too much. We're now under pressure. We're now stressed out. People start walking or running as fast as they possibly can. Now it's left a few people. There's commitments in place. There's contracts being signed. There's builders involved. There's funders involved, and it becomes a very, very stressful environment for everyone that's involved in it. All because they went off, ran into this thing without thinking it through. So it's really important that you have the structures in place to do the various different projects. So the first thing we look at is structures in terms of, now you're all more than likely at this point structured as maybe more than likely companies limited by guarantee without share capital. You might have a constituted group, so just literally a normal community voluntary organization that's working on under the rules and their rules and roles and responsibilities that are outlined in our constitution. But if you are a company limited by guarantee without share capital, that's probably the structure you want to be aiming towards anyway if you're developing large scale projects. So with that sort of structure, you're going to have a voluntary board of directors. Again, they're volunteers, but they have responsibilities as directors. So even though volunteers not being paid, they're responsible under company law the same way that I would be responsible for my company under company law as director of a company. That's very important. We are going to be doing a workshop in the new year on governance and on responsibilities and on the charities regulator. And we'll have experts in this field talking about what the responsibilities are and how to structure your organization so that it's well governed. From a funding perspective, this is really important because you need to show the funding organizations we are capable of managing public funds. We're capable of getting this project off the ground, implementing it and getting it done in time, on schedule, within budget. Okay. If you don't have track record, that's difficult to convince them of. If you have track record and it's a good track record, you're going to have more of a chance of getting funding than an organization that doesn't have a track record or an organization who has a poor track record. So again, we would always get groups to review, audit their structure in terms of is there proper structures in place? Are the right people in place? Is there gaps in terms of skills and qualifications and experience in the organization? If there is, how do we fill them? And then finally, we look at in terms of how the company organization is governed. So there was a governance code a number of years ago, which was basically the kind of a national governance code that was launched. And it was self-regulated, which was always a bad idea in Ireland to have anything self-regulated. There was no real kind of, I suppose, punishment if you didn't do it. And what happened was that it was basically tick the box exercises. And people were ticking the boxes, but they were just ticking the box. They weren't actually doing anything behind it. So they were saying, oh yeah, we've all these things done, tick a box, and people believed them. And it was a bit of a really, I never agreed with it from day one because it was kind of just kind of bureaucratic kind of thing that people had to do. But then people kind of realized afterwards that there was no really checking to see were all these things in place. So they just kind of drove on and said they'd done X, Y, and Z. And that was never going to work. Then the charities regulator was formed. And they came in and they basically disbanded. Well, they didn't do it, but the governance code and the whole committee and all that was disbanded and was done away with. So it's a complete waste of time, really, to be honest. And they brought in their own code of governance. The difference between the old one and the new one is that this is regulated. You're basically being audited and being monitored by the regulator. So you have to do certain things you said you're going to do and you are doing. There's a lot of work involved in meeting the requirements of the regulator. And it is an awful lot of work involved, and a lot of groups, committees don't want to do it because they're volunteers and there's a lot of paperwork, and it is sometimes a bit complex, and people just get kind of confused by the whole thing. However, in my opinion, if you do this once and you kind of suffer through the pain of doing it once, you have done then, and it's all it needs is kind of top up and kind of review on an ongoing basis once a year. Most of the policy and procedures that are required don't really change too often. There might be certain changes to them in terms of wording, or maybe certain things have changed in the organization that needs the policy and procedures to be reviewed and just updated. But you don't have to go back through the whole process over and over and over and over again. So there's a lot of pain and work involved at the initial stages, but it's really worth it going forward because, as I said, you're not going to be doing this thing every single year. You're just reviewing it every year. But it is something that if you've ticked all the boxes and you're actually implementing the policy and procedures that you said you were going to do, as outlined by the regulator, you've met all the criteria for all the potential funding down the line. Okay, so pretty much by doing all the work for the regulator, you've also now have all the work done for all the other funding organizations, because the funding organizations that are going to be supporting you want to know that are you being monitored, regulated, audited by external bodies. You're already being audited you're already being monitored and audited to a point by your company accountant, because they're doing the company returns. So they're sign off saying these accounts are true and accurate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You're already being audited by revenue. So you're doing returns to revenue. So they're kind of a watchdog looking over, make sure that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. And now you're being monitored and audited by the regulator, because you've got returns to do to regulator and reports to the regulator. So from a funding perspective, if I'm a funder, I'm going to have confidence in you because I know there's more than me looking at you. There's a lot of accountability there, and there's a lot of monitoring going on within your structure by external bodies. You might also be funded by the HSC or by Public or by TUSLA. They're also getting returns from you each year, so they're also a monitoring body looking at what you're doing. Okay, so there's very, very few places to hide anymore within the sector, because you've got so much returns to do and so much reporting and so much audit trails in play. That's a good thing, because now it is a pain in terms of administration and bureaucracy, but it's a good thing because if you're keeping on top of this and you're doing it well, you're just going to make it way more easier for you to secure funding down the line. You're also going to make it easier for your organization to run smoothly without any hiccups, because you'll have all your foundation stones in place. You have all your policy and procedures in place. Like people say, why do I need to have a policy and procedure for health and safety? Well, from a basic point of view, your insurance. The policy and procedures aren't there just to kind of, someone has come up with these just to kind of make life awkward for you. They're there because it protects your organization, protects your board, it protects your staff, and protects your company. And it ultimately protects the people you're actually working with on the ground as well. Because if something's wrong and you've got to shut the whole thing down because you haven't followed procedure, that means that they're now without a service. Okay, so it's as serious as that. Yes, there's a lot of work involved in it, but it is worth it, because it just makes sure that you don't have to worry about a foundation of your organization causing a problem down the line. So you could have the best strategy in the world, the best team in the world, the best services in the world, but if the foundation is weak, the whole thing's going to crumble down. Very, very important. If you're looking at the governance code, and it's the responsibility of the boards to do this. Okay, so if you're a coordinator or manager of an organization, it's not your responsibility, it's the board's responsibility. Okay, so if a board member comes to you and says, look, we've heard about this thing, go off and do it and tell us when it's done, it's not your responsibility, it's their responsibility. Yes, you can support them on it, but ultimately they have to be the ones that are doing up this, and they're the ones that have to sign off on it. So if you're preparing a policy and procedure document around anything, so it can be around governance, could be around health and safety, could be around volunteer policy, your employment contracts, handbooks, it could be child protection policies, whatever it is. Yes, you can prepare them with the board, but the board are ultimately signing off on them. Okay, so the board have to read them, go through them, question it, and come back and say, yeah, we're happy enough with them, we're going to make some changes to it, make some edits to it, but it's ultimately their responsibility. Very, very important. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. If you have a situation then where you've got directors that are coming on board as new directors, or new members coming on board, or just members committees, they also need to sign up to and be aware of the policies and procedures as well. Okay, so that everyone is aware of them and the consequences of them, which is very important. So that's your overall, say, governance structure. This is a kind of sample organizational chart that I use. It's a template I use for projects we work on. So if we're writing strategic plans and we're doing an overview of the company or the organization, we use this template as an organizational chart. Now, some people don't like organizational charts because they're very hierarchical, okay? And that's fine. It's just it looks that way, but it's easier for someone to understand the way the organization works and the structure if they don't know what you're doing. So if you're trying to explain to someone how our organization works, it's difficult for them to understand it, because it's not like a company where you have, we have a CEO, you might have a board, you have a CEO, you've got a marketing department, finance department, production department, logistics department, whatever it might be, right? So it's kind of, people kind of understand those structures. Within a community voluntary organization, it can be a very complex structure. Okay, this is actually, it looks like a fairly complicated one on the screen. This is actually a fairly basic structure compared to other projects we work on. Because we got some organizations that have got, a number of different business units. So they might have, like, say, they might have childcare, they might have a Meals on Wheels, they might have a community facility, they might have remote working space, they might have transport, all operating under the one company. So they have multiple kind of things going on. So with this organization chart here, it gives the person who's external to the organization, a funder or a donor or a sponsor, gives them an overview of how the company is structured, okay, or the organization is structured. So you might have a voluntary board of directors. Okay, now if you don't have if you're only a constituted group, you don't have a company structure, this would be your voluntary management committee. Okay, we would always recommend a minimum of 2 subcommittees. And those 2 subcommittees would be your executive committee, which is, you can call it whatever you want to call it. It could be working committee, it could be management committee. I just call it an executive committee because they're making executive decisions on behalf of the company and of the board. Under this executive committee, they would be responsible for finance and HR. Some groups would have a finance committee and a separate HR committee. I put them together because in most organizations, you don't have a huge amount of board of directors. Like, there's not 40 directors on board. So it's kind of the same people. So rather asking a person to go to 2 separate meetings to discuss 2 separate topics, why not just amalgamate them and have one meeting where you discuss both topics at one meeting? So, like, it's kind of when you get the picture of the person saying, I'm going to meeting tonight, it's a finance committee meeting, and then next Tuesday night I'm going to another meeting, it's the HR committee meeting. Why not just put them in the same bloody meeting? And reduce people's time and their effort they have to put in. So the executive is responsible for the key decisions that the company needs to make around finance and around HR. You could also throw in health and safety in there as well. I use the word throw in there when I say that. If your organization hasn't a huge amount of, I say a huge amount of health and safety responsibility. In other words, I say if you've got a project where you don't have any staff, or you don't have any people coming into your building, or you're not responsible for childcare or working with vulnerable people, health and safety is important from a health and safety point of view, but it's not as important, let's say, if you've got 40 kids coming into childcare every morning. Okay, so in situations where health and safety or quality control or quality assurance is really important, you have a separate committee for that. So, for example, if you're a Section 39, Section 38 HSE funded project, you have to have I can't remember exact title they have, but it's like a quality control, quality kind of team committee that are responsible for the quality of service delivery. And that team normally are responsible for compliance around health and safety and around patient care, around client care, around, depending on the project. But it's a very, very specific type of committee that you have to have in place as part of your service level agreement. So if it is a very important thing, have it as a separate one. If it's not as important for your structure, have your executive committee responsible for it. So basically what the executive committee does is that they will go through, for example, on the finances, things like, say, income and expenditure for the last month. And they'll go through it in detail. Okay, and they sign off on it. So the financial report is signed off on by the executive committee at their meeting. Then at the board meeting, the board don't have to go through every single item of the finance report because it's already been done by the executive. They've signed off on it. Okay, so it speeds up the board meetings. They're dealing with more kind of strategic decisions and discussion, as opposed to, we're paying 10 cents more this week for biscuits than we paid last week. That kind of carry on. Okay, so it's not all the kind of minutiae details covered at the executive meeting rather than at the board meeting. If there's a HR issue, disciplinary issue, recruitment issue, someone's been employed, dealing with employment contracts, that's all dealt by the executive committee. Again, it's not being dealt at the board meeting. They're saying, okay, we've recruited this person, we've interviewed 7 people from this person's person we're hiring because of X, Y, and Z. We're now in the process of issuing them a contract. Okay, there's no need for the board to be involved in the entire part of that. Okay, so it's really important that the board give, I suppose, the authority to this committee to make those decisions. Very, very important. The fundraising committee is the second one we would always recommend. The reason being is that unless you've got like core funding from a government department or HSC or public, whoever it might be, you're always going to be relying on generating revenue. Okay, so your fundraising team are the kind of team that's going to go out there and bring in that money, whether it be grants, whether it be fundraising, whether it be sponsors, partners, whatever it is, they're responsible for that. They obviously will be in discussion with the finance committee because they're bringing the money to the table. Okay, but it is so important in not-for-profit organizations because it's the fuel that keeps the engine going, that you should have a committee responsible for it. Not just one person, because that one person walks, you now lost your key salesperson who's bringing the money in. And I would equate fundraising teams to sales teams because they're bringing the cash in. You can then have project committees. So the project committees would be committees that are responsible for certain things within an organization. So if you take a sports club, for example, they'll have an executive committee or a management committee. And then you might have, let's say, a coaching committee who's responsible for coaching and coaches. You might have a child welfare committee. You might have an academy committee responsible for the academy section of the club. You might have a field committee responsible for maintenance of the field and the pitch and the dressing rooms, things like that. If the club is a clubhouse and a bar, you might have a clubhouse and bar committee. So they're all responsible for specific things within the organization. So the person who's responsible for the bar, for example, isn't outlining the pitches or coaching. Okay, the person who's coaching or lining the pitches isn't responsible for managing the bar. But there might be overlap there, but you have specific people or specific teams doing specific things. Okay, and that goes back to your action plan again. It means that all your actions are delegated out to people. You're spreading the workload within the organization. There's less burnout. There's less pressure being put on any one person or a number of people to get stuff done, which is very, very important. And then you have within your memos and articles of association or within your companies or your group's rules and regulations, you would have a clause in there that a project committee can be formed from time to time. And these are kind of ad hoc committees that are set up to develop specific projects. So that building project committee I mentioned a while ago for that example in the action plan, that might be in place from the minute that the building project is starting in terms of the assessment of the project, the feasibility study, through planning, through construction, through opening the doors. Once the doors are open, that building committee is gone. Okay, it might be a committee brought in to do a kind of a one-off pilot project. Once that project is done, they're gone. Special project committees are good to get in external people on a short-term basis to give them an idea of what's involved in the organization. So there's very little long-term commitment asked of them, but you're hoping that their involvement at this stage in a kind of a one-off project will encourage them to stay involved in the overall organization. So it's a really good way of getting key people on board, because there's an exit clause at the end of it. They can leave at the end of the project. My job is done here. I'm out of here. They might want to stay on board because they like what you're doing. The person here, the manager coordinator, if your project, and some of you are in management and coordination positions, so you are this person. If your project is lucky enough to have funding to be able to employ a manager or a coordinator, I just put in they're just terms. Some people don't like using the word manager because they want to kind of say more coordination role rather than the management role. But it's whatever word you want to use. That person is the person who's kind of holding the whole thing together, right? So they're the link between the board and the staff and volunteers, and they're responsible for helping the board achieve their overall objectives. Okay, they're not responsible for developing the strategy. They're not responsible for coming up with all the actions. They're responsible for making sure that they're implemented and they're achieved. Okay, a lot of voluntary organizations and voluntary boards will hand over entire responsibility to the manager and coordinator. Okay, which is an absolute disaster, and it's a disaster for one main reason. That coordinator manager becomes the scaffolding around which the entire organization is sitting. Okay, so if you see a building and you see it being propped up by scaffolding, okay, what happens when you take the scaffolding down? the entire building falls in on itself. Okay, it just crumbles and falls apart. If there's one person that's kind of pulling all the strings in the organization, is responsible for everything, is the only person that knows where the funding is coming from, is the only person that's got access to the accounts, is the only person who knows where the lease for the building is the only person who knows what the access code into the building is. If that person is gone, short-term holidays, is out sick, you have massive problems. If that person gets burnt out, walks from the organization or takes on a better job somewhere else, then your entire organization crumbles to the ground. Okay, they're there to do a specific piece of work. They're not there to shoulder the entire responsibility of the organization. They're there to support the board. They're there to advise the board, to encourage, give some direction to the board, but they're not there to keep the whole thing going. Okay, very, very important. If you're in a position where you are a manager or coordinator and you feel you are that person that's being landed with everything, that's something that really needs to be addressed with your board, because it's one of the key things that's going to cause major problems down the line. In my experience, and I've seen it where you've got really successful organizations, they're successful because they got a very good person on board, in play in terms of the coordination role. That coordinator is taken for granted a lot, and that coordinator walks, and everything behind them on the way out is falling behind, burning to the ground as they walk out the door. A disaster. Okay, you have to make sure. And the other side of that is, a lot of times managers, coordinators take on those roles. They feel they're in total control. They don't engage with, communicate with anyone else, and they create that problem themselves. That's another issue. So if you're a board member and you have a situation where a coordinator is that type of person, that's another issue that needs to be addressed very, very quickly. We tend to do that a lot when we're assessing organizations as part of the planning process. We'll spot that very, very quickly within an organization, very quickly, where there's issues where there's too much control on either the board, members of the board, or with a coordinator, and we address that. Now, we can, because we're objective. Sometimes people don't like it. They call us out on it, but you've got to call a spade if it's going to impact the organization down the line. You might have the staff. So staff might be direct employees, employment schemes, graduate and student placement. I'll talk about that later on. And you're going to have volunteers. Now, the majority of organizations are run, led, and survive purely because you've got voluntary support. Okay, in Ireland, we have a very, very good tradition of volunteering. Pretty much the country would be on its knees long ago unless there was volunteers doing work across communities, providing essential services for people of all ages. And we do volunteering very, very good. What happens is, in a lot of organizations, is volunteers are taken for granted. Okay, volunteers aren't utilized properly, so their skills aren't utilized because they've never been asked to do different things that they might be good at. They're just being brought in to kind of, to bring in more resources. It's really important that you got a very, very strong watertight volunteer recruitment policy, and you have a very good volunteer management policy in place as well. Your volunteers, even though they might be employees of the company, have rights, and they're responsible as well to represent the organization. So they have to be aware of the policy and procedures, and they have to sign up to those policies and procedures as well. Because your volunteer, even though they're not being paid, are, in a lot of cases, the face of your organization. So they can't go off and do stupid things and go off and go rogue. They have to kind of tie in with and buy into the whole strategy. They have to buy into where the organization is going to. They have to, buy into the policy and procedures and follow those that are being laid out to them by the organization. But to get them more involved, they also need to be involved in the planning and the strategic process as well. Not just being told this is what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. They need to be asked their opinions. What do you think? Get them involved in the planning sessions, get them involved in the assessment, talk to them, evaluate, do evaluation with them, do surveys with them, do focus groups with them, meet them one-to-one, get them more involved. Very, very important. There's a big issue at the moment with volunteering nationally. A lot of people are not getting involved in volunteering anymore because they're just busy with life, no time. A lot of the older volunteers that were working with organizations for the last, for years and years and years, since COVID, have been stepping back a bit because just they don't want to get involved. They're isolating. There's a fear of getting out there within the community. So a lot of the older volunteers aren't getting involved anymore. A lot of them aren't willing to or able to get involved in the kind of the whole online approach that's not being taken with say Zoom meetings and all that. So they're moving away from volunteering, which is not good. There's always been difficulties in getting volunteers from the younger volunteers involved. You need to look at how we can recruit young volunteers onto our structures. Very, very important. We're working with a group out in Asti at the moment, Asti Community Development Association, and they've got a good few people in their 30s involved. Amazing energy, great ideas. They get stuff done. They're just coming from that background. They're all working in the private sector. They're all working at a very fast pace. They're all working to kind of in action-led companies, and they're bringing those skills into their volunteering work. And it's amazing the amount of work to get achieved and they get done. And it's just because they also bring new ideas as well. So if you've got a good mix of ages within any structure, it's always very, very good. So look at doing how you do that as well. And then look at external support. And it just baffles me why organizations don't do this. There's a lot of people out there on your doorsteps that have skills and experience and qualifications that are going to benefit you, okay? And you just need to ask them. And in some cases, people say, no, I'm not getting involved. Or in other cases, they're waiting to be asked and they love to get involved in a local project where they can use their skills and experience. They might want to get involved in things like backpacking or litter picking or painting walls or putting flowers into flower baskets or flower beds or whatever. But they might want to get involved where they can actually use their skills and experience. So things like, say, your accounts, your finances. There's bound to be an accountant that locally that you can go to and say, look, can you give us some advice in terms of maybe the charities regulations, what we need to do? Can you give some advice in terms of helping us structure our account system better? Can you advise on what software packages you're using for bookkeeping? Whatever my question might be. There might be a solicitor living locally that or aware of that can give you some legal advice for free. Okay, there might be a HR person to give you some advice around HR. There might be a young person or an older person that's really good at social media that might be out of work at the moment, that's got time on their hands. There might be a student looking for some work experience. Get them involved and help you with social media. There might be a web development company out there on your doorstep that you go and say, look, we don't have any money for a website, we really need one. Can you build one for us? You're not asking for €3,000 cash to be donated to you. You're asking them for help with putting a website together. Don't be afraid to go there. If you've got a building project and we're going to be at the mercy of architects and engineers here because we have no idea what we're doing, ask someone locally who's an architect or engineer, possibly retired, who doesn't want to do the work because they're retired now, they don't want this contract, but they might come on board and sit on a committee just to basically keep an eye on what's coming back from the architect and engineer. Saying that's ridiculous, that fee is way too high. They could do for a lot less than that. So you're just being protected. And you got the support agencies. So NWKD, South Kerry Development Partnership, Kerry County Council, your funding agencies, PUBL, TUSLA, HSC, they've all got people within these organizations that are there to support you. Okay, so funding organizations, they're not going to throw money at you and not protect that money, not protect that investment. They're going to have staff working in those organizations who will be at the end of a phone call or at the end of an email to advise you and to support you and give you direction. So no matter where you're getting funding from, there will be someone there that will advise you on the drawdown requirements, the criteria, whatever it might be, because it's in their best interest to make sure you spend the money right. So they're not going to leave you at your own devices without any support. The development officers within local development companies, so North East West Kerry Development, South Kerry Development Partnership, Udros Nagueltuta, they're paid to support the local communities. So when I worked with Caroline back in Partnership Tralee back in the day, my job was to work with social enterprises in Tralee to get them funding, get them off the ground. To meet them, talk to them, look what their needs were, help them with applications, all these things. That's what I was paid to do. That was my job. So at the end of the day, if there was no projects funded and no support given, then I wasn't doing my job. So use them. That's what they're there for. And if they can't advise you and support you, they'll have people that they know, contacts, networks, wider networks, locally or nationally, that can provide that support for you, advice for you. So use them as well. The one area that I would say to you where I would strongly advise paying for support and paying for advice is where you're into areas of where there's illegal implications. So I wouldn't ask someone to do on a voluntary basis to do up your employment contracts for you. Okay, you need someone to be able to stand over those. So it needs to be a contract in place where you're paying for services and you're paying for them to sign off on it. So if something goes wrong and you're saying, okay, we have an employment contract in place here, we've been taken to the there's an employment case being taken against us by one of our employees. We'll revert back to our employment contracts, which we now realize were incorrect. You've no way of going back to the person who did it for you because it's on a voluntary basis. There's no you could argue that they did this on a voluntary capacity, but they were still professional and they still should have done it right. But then you have to argue that. Whereas you pay for someone to do it, you're not suing them because they signed off on it. You paid them, they have indemnity insurance to cover themselves for any claims. The same would be with any sort of legal contracts, legal agreements, leases, things like that. Pay someone to do it. Health and safety, pay someone to do it. Again, you can get in someone, I can do health and safety for you. I'll go in and do a safety statement for you, no problem at all. I'm busy now at the moment, so in a couple of weeks' time. And then you say, can you have a chance to do a safety statement? Oh, yeah, I'll get to know after Christmas because I'm really busy up to Christmas. You're paying someone to do it, they'll have to do it by a certain time. You're paying it has to be done right. If something's wrong, you can go back and say, well, you told us X, Y, and Z. We're now countersuing you because it's your fault. Very important. Okay. If you're bringing in something on a voluntary basis, one, if it's wrong, can you go back to them and say, can you do it again because it's done wrong? If there's a problem, you're kind of thinking, I can't give out to them because they're doing it on a voluntary basis. It's taking forever to do, but we can't say no, we can't give out to them because they're doing it for free. That's where it causes problems. You call in a lot of favors, but that's an issue sometimes. Absolutely call in favors just to get some sort of advice or some sort of information or guidance on it. But when it comes to actually doing certain pieces of work, pay for it to be done because you can now stand over it and they have to stand over it, but you also got them to fall back on if it goes wrong. Very, very important. Okay, because again, if you don't do that, you can do it on kind of a voluntary basis, they can deny it as well. I only taught them the basics. I wasn't aware that they were actually going to use this employment contract. I gave them a template. It's your word in against their word. So very, very important. That's why all consultants have professional indemnity insurance. They're covering themselves for any cases that come up that they're charged. Well, it's your fault. You told us to do X, Y, and Z. That's why I always put very big, bold disclaimers into my plans. And we can say, make sure you get proper financial advice, legal advice, structural advice before you do X, Y, and Z, because we're not telling you to do it unless you have this advice in place. But that's still up in court. I hope the God does. So again, just make sure that if you are paying for it, that they can stand over. Very important with certain things, but definitely with HR, definitely with contracts, anything to do with kind of legal issues, very, very important. In terms of committees, as I said, recommend 2 committees, executive committee and a fundraising committee. Staff, it's really only possible to employ staff if you got core grant aid. So what I mean by core grant aid is where you're given funding on an ongoing basis to operate your projects. That'd be like, say, community services program, which funds social enterprises. So that funds a manager and a number of employees. You might be funded under HSC, Section 38 or Section 39, where again, they're subcontracting the service delivery to yourselves. So a disability organization, for example, would be just providing, say, supports to people with intellectual disabilities, are being paid by the HSC to provide services on their behalf. So that funds will cover, more often than not, say, clinical staff, nursing staff, social care, counselling staff, depending on what the organization is, might support things like maybe contribution towards rent and utilities as well. But it's mostly towards paying for people to provide the services on their behalf. You might be funded under a TUSLET, your Family Resource Centre. Again, if you are and you have core grant aid, that's fantastic. The one thing I would say is, though, don't become reliant on it, because you're reliant on core grant aid that you have to apply for every year. It's not simply getting it automatically each year. You got to go back and do returns. You got to put together maybe a business plan, maybe every couple of years, or a strategic plan to show where the money's going to now, and you've got to be audited, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But normally, unless you're doing something really stupid, they tend to refund each year. However, if you become reliant on it, and if there's cutbacks, and there's always going to be cutbacks, and God knows there will be cutbacks probably in the next couple of years to pay for COVID, you will see grants being cut by a certain amount of percentages. You might see funds being moved from one department to another department. So, for example, with the community service program, that was known as the FOSS social economy program back in the early 2000s. They took it from FOSS and put it into PUBL, okay, which created major problems for the groups that were being core granted, because now they had to change their they had a new way of operating. There were new criteria, new rules and guidelines brought in, and some of them weren't funded anymore, and some had to kind of drastically reduce their staffing levels. So things can happen within core funding that you don't have control over. So don't be reliant on it completely. It might be 70% of your budget, but make sure there's other funding sources there that you can tap into. Employment schemes, without them and volunteers, there would be no community volunteer organizations nationally. Simple as that. People give out about them. They're not fit for purpose in a lot of cases. They're not the most streamlined schemes in the world. They could be done a lot better, in my opinion. But without them, things won't happen. Every organization pretty much out there, whether it be a GA club to a local community centre, are reliant on schemes to bring in staff. So you got your rural social scheme people, your community employment staff, your two staff as well. Now, again, you can be very lucky and get really good people on board that actually move from a scheme to maybe full-time employment within the organization, which happens a lot. And in my experience of 20 years working in the local development sector, I would know many people who would have started off in CSE participants on programs who are now in management roles, coordination roles, who are senior management roles in some cases in organizations. I know one lady who I worked with above in Northside Partnership who came in on a CE work placement in the enterprise department that I worked in, and she's now in a very senior role within Enterprise Ireland in Dublin, on big money, very responsible job, but came in for a 2-year placement within Northside, proved herself to be very, very capable, was recruited as an enterprise officer alongside me back in 1999, and is now working in Enterprise Ireland. So you can get really good people. The difficulty with community employment schemes is that because you got a rollover, there's a lot of changes too. So you might have a very good person in there, but then they're moved on, and you're then trying to recruit and get our people up to speed again. But it's really important, if you can avail of workers under these schemes locally, try to maximize as you possibly can. The other one that a lot of community volunteer organizations don't tap into, I don't know really why, is graduate and student placements as well. So each year we would take on in HQ Tralee, we would take on about maybe 4 student placements from MTU. Normally kind of in marketing, business development, social media studies primarily. Some are really, really good, some aren't that good, but they do, they do kind of fill a gap where you need support maybe for specific projects. And a lot of them do bring a lot of experience, not experience, but bring a lot of skills to the table as well. Primarily in areas like social media. Because it's an area that a lot of community volunteer organizations don't focus on. And again, there's a course in that in the new year on using online platforms. It's an area that a lot of us, including myself, will be weak on. A lot of the community volunteer organizations I work with don't use social media at all in any shape or form. Bring in someone like young people. That's what they live on. They're that's part of their hand. They're on social media constantly. Get them in. They'll help you with getting these things off the ground, getting things in place. Plus, as well, if they're smart, and a lot of students are, they'll say, well, after the student placement's over, I need a summer job. Will they take me on for the summer? We had an issue last 2 weeks ago with a student placement from MTU, and she has to ask the interview, says, if I work out with the placement for 3 months, from January till February, March, April, would you keep me on for the summer and pay me? And I'm just going, fair play to her, we might see that's kind of cheeky, but I thought this one's got initiative, I said, yeah, absolutely. Depending on obviously the 3 months you're working for us, that you're any good. Yeah, we will keep you on for the summer. And maybe possibly after you finish your college course, we keep you on and employ you, which we have done with another student placement from 2 years ago. So there is placements of people out there. There is graduates out there that don't work, that are looking for experience. And it's not just graduates in, say, social studies or community development or anything like that. It's graduates that you can bring in that are going to help you with the business side of the business side of your organization as well. Business studies students, social media students, marketing students, account students, they're looking for work experience. Because your companies, just because you're not, a corporate organization, you're still companies, they can still get, very good relevant work experience with you. So again, use them as well. Not saying free, because you can, if you want to, and you should pay them. I think it's about €200 a week is something, I think is a student placement rate. But again, some students will work for free. Volunteers, make sure, again, as I said, recruitment strategy, very important. You want to make sure, and again, I'm being very blunt with this, the last thing you want to do is have someone that's volunteering just to be a nuisance, okay? that are going to cause problems, rock the ship, just get in people's way, be annoying, because it's very difficult to fire a staff member. It's very difficult to get rid of the volunteer because they're volunteering. Okay, so make sure when you're recruiting, look for people that can bring key skills and experience. I was trying to get as many people as you can involved, but again, make sure there's very, very good policies in place in relation to the way they operate and the way they're managed as well. Very important. As I said, with the voluntary external support, use volunteers as well to provide in-kind support. A lot of organizations, as I said, might want to give money to the organization because they see that has been just gone and they see no value in it, but they might want to do something like a marketing campaign for you. They might print posters for you. They might do branding for you. They might do a website for you. I know there's a few web development companies in Kerry that are currently working with various different charitable organizations, and they're saying our charity partner for the year is whoever, and they're doing a website for them and managing that website for 12 months. So there's a number of companies doing that. If I was in my case, what I do, we do a lot of work in kind support for organizations where we don't ask for payment and we don't get payment for it. And the reason we do it, one is because we like the organization, or we know the person's involved and we're doing it as a favor for them, or we see benefits. So I get involved in my local school because our kids are going there, get involved in my local soccer, or the soccer club because my kids are playing soccer there. But I also sometimes get involved with organizations I don't know, give them some free supports, knowing that I get business out of it down the line. Okay, so from the business marketing point of view, it makes sense for companies to get involved with organizations. And if they're not aware of why they should get involved and where the goodwill will come afterwards, they need to be told that. So I know in the past, we went to companies in local towns where the local community volunteer organization was providing a childcare facility. And because we were providing childcare, it meant that the parents could go and work in this local company because there was a local provider providing childcare. And we said, we're not asking you to put a childcare facility in your factory or your offices because this group up here providing the childcare, because they are indirectly, your staff are benefiting from that. Can you support us? So you're saying, look, we're giving you an option here. Can you give us something back now in return from it? So it's just how you approach these companies. They have money, they have resources, they have skills. If they have no money, they still have the skills and resources they can provide for it. I know Walter Crystal for years used to provide mentors to local community volunteer organizations in the areas of things like finance and legal. So they seconded their staff to work with groups on different projects, and they would be paying their staff. And that was another way of getting support without having to pay for that support. So the next thing in terms of a project is getting it off the ground from an implementation point of view. Let's say you got the structures in place, you're well organized, you've got a good group, you got enough people who know what they're doing, you've enough volunteers, enough of the human resources. Now you need to look at the funding side of it. And I put funding after the organization because without the organization, the funding is irrelevant. There's no point having 100,000 euros if you've no one there to actually spend the money and manage it. It's kind of pointless. So you always start the organization first. If you don't have the organization, you won't get access to the funding. If you don't have the organization that's well capable of doing what it's supposed to do, no one's going to fund you. No funding organization is going to take a punt on another organization that they're not too sure about. Are they capable of managing this? Are they capable of spending it? Are they capable of doing what they're saying they're going to do? They just won't get involved. There's too many other good organizations out there that they'll get involved with first. If you don't have the organization on the ground, you're also not going to be organized to fundraise. So therefore, you get no access to funding through that way either. So we always focus on the organization first. So the funding that you were going to require for any project, doesn't matter what it is, you're going to have a certain level of operational costs. So money to pay for light and heat, rent, staff, materials, equipment, whatever it might be. Okay, that's ongoing funding. It's very important as part of your analysis that we discussed last week that you review your cost structure and see where you're spending money and if you're spending too much money on certain things. Okay, it's very, very important. Like your household budget, you need to know what you're spending every month because you need to figure out how we're going to get the money in to cover the money going out. So the first thing we look at when we're talking about funding is looking, okay, well, what money do you need? What's the target here? What funding do you require? Now, every organization that's out there, because they're not for profit, they feel that we just need to break even. You know, if we've got €1,000 going out and we have €1,000 coming in, we're okay because we broke even and we're not making profits. It's very, very important. It's something that if you don't remember any other slide or anything else to say since last week or this week, just because you're a not-for-profit organization doesn't mean you're for a loss organization. So you're not for loss. Okay, we had a meeting with a funding agency, with a company I worked with, a contract with, last couple of years. But the very first time we met them, we were looking for funding off them, and they said to us, "Well, you already got core funding from another source," and we said, "Yes, we have." And I said, "But you're already beginning fees, and you've got a very good fundraising. Why do you need money from us? If we give you money, sure, your organization will be making a profit." And I said to them, Costello said, "We're not for profit, but we're also not for loss. It doesn't matter if we make a profit. A not-for-profit company can make a profit. Okay, the only difference between a not-for-profit company and a profitable private company is that the profit that company makes has to go back into the organization, or it has to fund the organization or fund other elements of the project or new projects. So if I've a profitable private company, the profit my company makes, it goes back to the shareholders as dividends, okay, or it stays within the company. If I've got a not-for-profit organization, company limited by guarantee, without share capital, there's no shareholders, there's no dividends within the company. The profits that company makes stays within the company and is used then for future projects within the company, okay? So it doesn't make a difference if you're making €1 million profit every year, okay? It doesn't matter. Once you've got clear policies in place in terms of how that money is going to be spent. And this is really important from a charity's perspective. So what you get your company accountant to do is, within your annual accounts, your annual returns to revenue and to the charities regulator, they would have a section within the accounts outlining your reserve policy. And your reserve policy is basically stating what do you do with the reserve funding in your organization. So if your organization is making a profit each year, in other words, it's bringing in more money than it's spending because you got a good fundraising strategy in place, or you got more grants than you thought you'd have coming in, whatever it might be, that money is sitting there as profit, as cash in your account. Okay, your company accountant will have a policy for that. That they will sit down and work out through yourselves. What we normally recommend is 6 months. Now, if you're a community services project, you have to have 13 weeks minimum operational costs in your account at any one time. In other words, if something goes wrong, that you got 13 weeks of money in your account to pay for things, right? We would say 6 months is the one I'd be targeting, because 13 weeks is just too short. You won't get back on track in time. You need 6 months pretty much to get another source of funding or have a fundraising strategy in place, whatever it might be. You just can't literally turn around an organization that quick in the not-for-profit sector, because you're not relying on sales to bring money in, you're relying on other forms of funding. So it's very important. You might have a reserve policy where you might be doing a building project in 2 or 3 years' time, and you're saying we need to keep money aside to use as matching funds for this project. So let's say, for example, you're developing a €100,000 extension, and you plan to do it within the next 2 years. You know that you're going to have 25% of that funding, right, for that project. So what you're going to do is you're going to hold in your company account in your bank a minimum of €25,000 to have available for that project when it starts up. Now, you might say, given inflation, the way things are going, we're going to have a buffer there, so we're going to have €35,000 in our account ready to put into that project when we're ready to go. You might be a transport company, and you're saying, okay, well, we need to purchase a new bus every 5 years because the bus is going to be, loads of mileage on it. So we're putting aside €100,000 in our account. So then 5 years' time, so €20,000 a year over 5 years. So we have €100,000 in our account to buy a new bus in 5 years' time. Okay, so they're what's called reserve policy. Nothing wrong with it, but a lot of organizations feel that, God, we can't be making a profit. How can we go out and fundraise if people know we're making loads of money? Right? You're making loads of money, absolutely fantastic, but that goes back into the organization. In some cases, the organization would have in their company accounts or the members of the Architects Association that if we make a reserve, and the reserve is more than what we need, we'll actually use that money to fund other projects within the community. Okay, so we have situations where you've got community councils, for example, that are kind of umbrella organizations, and they will bring in money for different projects, and they will then allocate that money out to projects underneath them. We would have seen disability organizations in the past where they would have achieved, substantial amount of funding, and they would have developed new projects to support their own client base, and then bring in other people, allow other people to join, and to spread the service they provide. So it's very important to look at your ongoing long-term funding requirements, because if you're working on a break-even basis, that's very, very dangerous territory, because if you're short a euro, it means you're making a loss. Okay. The difference between my business and your business is that I can go out there and just work harder and sell more, and call Caroline and try and sell more courses and try to push for more funds or whatever it might be, or just go out there and do more private consultancy or whatever. You can't, because you're not selling a product or a service. You can't sell more because you're relying on, you can't just decide, right, tomorrow morning we'll hit the streets and do a fundraiser. You just can't. So you can't just generate money very quickly. So you got to make sure you've always got that buffer in place that allows you to develop, allows for a rainy day where there's no money coming in, that you can still keep the show on the road. Very, very important. You might need money for feasibility studies or project analysis, and there is funding for that through Leader, for example. You might then have projects you want to develop, and you might need capital funding for that. So it might be equipment you need to purchase, again, building works. You might be redecorating, redesigning the property. It might be buying a bus. It might be buying a vehicle. It might be buying a lawnmower for landscaping. Whatever it is, you need to look at, okay, how much is that going to cost, and where's the money going to come from? Very important with your strategic plan, that if you're looking at new project development, and again, this is very, very important, because a lot of groups do it, they'll start subsidizing the new project with operational funding. Okay, so I'm going to give you the analogy of your household budget. Let's say you've got a household budget and you know what's going out every month in terms of mortgage, food, Sky, broadband, utilities, clothes, going out, diesel, whatever it might be, right? And you know there's money coming in to cover all that. And you decide, right, what we're going to do here now is we're going to build an extension to the house. Okay, we can't really afford to, but we get a loan, right? And you go off to the bank, and the bank give you a loan. Now the loan repayments are on top of your operational costs for your house. Your household budget now is a loan repayment on top of that. If you're in a situation where you're kind of break even with your household budget, something's got to give somewhere else to cover the loan repayments. So what happens normally, people stop going out. They shop more in pennies as opposed to shopping somewhere else. They don't eat as much. They don't go on holidays anymore. They don't get the nice car. The kids don't get the nice boots anymore because they can't afford it, because they're paying off this bloody loan for this new project that's developed. Okay. With a community volunteer organization, that's the exact same thing happens. They add on another layer of costs onto their operational costs, and it puts them under pressure. Okay. So only develop a capital project or buying equipment or whatever it might be, where you can fund that standalone, separate from your main core business. Okay. So if you're developing a project, your fundraising should be specifically for that project, not impact on your operational costs. Okay, so if you're going out there doing a building project, you're trying to fundraise for that building project. Help us build a new center, help us build a new playground, help us build a new whatever. Okay, that money's going straight to that project and that project only. It's not being subsidized by your operational funding. Okay, if you've got reserves, if the reserves are there for that project, that's fine. But if they're not, don't take your reserves to pay for it. Okay. You don't, raid the piggy bank and, take the holiday budget to cover something else within the house because you budgeted badly throughout the year. Very important that if you're developing new projects, they got to stand on their own merits. Otherwise, you're going to be subsidizing forevermore. I know a lot of groups who got funding for building works. They got the funding to build got the funding to build the building. They never got funding to keep the lights on, keep it insured. And now they're struggling to keep the doors open because they can't afford the extra utility costs, can't afford the extra insurance costs. I know many organizations who got funding for buses, for vehicles, or got them donated, but they never got the bus driver donated or the diesel donated. So they can't drive them because they have no money to drive them. Okay, because they never thought about, geez, it'd be great to get a bus. And we're after getting it handed to us by some donor. How do we actually get this bus? Now the volunteer driver and the directors are putting their hand in their pocket to pay for diesel. That's madness. So make sure if you're developing new projects, has to be standalone, very, very important. So with the funding, I was going to skip that slide because the slide we will cover in the financial planning. With the funding side of it, if you look at the sources of funding in. And there is a workshop, as I said, next week on financial planning, which goes into this in way more detail in terms of how to look at your financial plan for 2022. The source of funding for your operational costs and for your ongoing funds and for your one-off projects and for your longer-term capital projects. I always start with fee income. So can you generate any money from fees for service you can provide, products you can sell? So again, a lot of charities would have charity shops run alongside them where the charity shops are bringing in revenue to subsidize the social service you're providing. Facilities you can rent out. So again, we're doing a lot of work with community centres at the moment, and they're looking at the revenue model through, can we rent out space? Can we rent out meeting rooms? Can we rent out the gym? Can we rent out the hall? Can we put in a cafe in there? Can we put in, whatever? Any way you can drive membership, drive revenue. We also look at the membership base, and a lot of groups don't do this. They don't have membership structures in place. So if you take, say, a GA club or a sports club, they have membership. So you pay an annual membership to join the club. So if your kids are joining the academy, they pay an annual fee to be members of the club. So it might be 120 euros, and they might get a jersey for that. Okay. You might say take a gym, for example, with a membership. So a community gym would generate revenue through membership. But you can also look at your organization in terms of, can you have a membership structure, right? Now, you might call it a membership. You might call it a friends of type structure where people annually pay to be a member of that organization. Now you have to say, well, what do we give them in return? Like, what's the reward here? What's the return here? It could be anything. Like we did a project years ago with an Adair, and we were trying to encourage them to set up a Friends of Adair membership type structure, which would help them. They were trying to put a new roof on their community hall, and they wouldn't do it. I'm like, you've got hundreds of thousands of tourists coming through every year, right? If they become a Friends of Adair, they sign up to an online, or sign up to membership. They're basically a member, a kind of an honorary member of the Adair community. What can you give them? You can give them a Christmas card every year. You give them access to your website. It's got a webcam on top of the community hall. They can look down Main Street of Adair. You can send them a calendar every year. You can send them photographs. You can send them whatever you want to send them. Because all you're asking is like for €5 to join. Let's say let's say 200,000 tourists going through. There's way more. But let's say 200,000 tourists going through the village. If 10% of them, 20,000 of them give you €5 every year, that's 100,000 euros a year in exchange for a Christmas card and a calendar and they're a blog that they can log into, or they can give their opinions on, the community, whatever. It's to my mind, it's simple, but it's no one does it. No one looks at that kind of structure to bring in ongoing money into it. One-off grants are fine. They're great. COVID, there was plenty of them. There's loads of COVID grants out there last year. There's going to be more this year. We heard more announcements today about more grant aid being pumped into the sector. It's gravy train stuff at the moment. It's absolutely, the country's awash with grants. And in a good way, because they're kind of emergency type grants, they're not as difficult to get as your normal grants are in terms of application forms. They're fairly straightforward. I won't say they're turning a blind eye to procurement and to all that. They're not, but it's certainly easier than your normal grant process. Like some of the grants last year were given out, I know a lot of organizations that could be selling PPE equipment, they could be selling screens, they could be selling tablets, they could be selling laptops because they just kept applying for them and getting them. Core grants, if your project is a project that is eligible for core grant funding under the HSE or under PUBL or whoever, absolutely go for it. Some people don't like going for core funding because they feel they're going to have to, they'll be led by and they're dictated to and directed by the main funding organization. That, to me, that's kind of, it doesn't happen that way. So if you're funded by the HSE, right, under Section 39, for example, absolutely you have to do everything the HSE wants you to do under your terms and agreements under your service level agreement you have with them. Of course you do, okay? But that doesn't stop you from doing other stuff. They can't stop you from doing other things that they're not funding at all. Okay, so for example, if I'm getting awarded a contract from Kerry County Council and Kerry PPN to do this training, I can do other stuff alongside it because I'm free to, right? If you're an organization, you're being co-funded by the HSE or PUBL to do specific pieces of work, you can do other things alongside it as well that they're not funding. So they can't dictate to you, anyone can't dictate to you what you're doing outside of their funding. So if they're paying you to do X, Y, and Z, you can do A, B, and C as well because they're not funding it. Okay, so that's very important. In some cases, organizations have separate companies that are doing, there's one company running one specific project, another company in another specific project. That can be complicated, it can be complex, it can be, a lot of administration involved, but it is another way of maximizing the amount of money back into your organization and your community. So I would know of projects, for example, that there'd be one company would own the community center and would run a number of services within the center. And then they would have set up separate companies like a childcare company, like a Meals on Wheels company, under that structure that can bring in more money. Okay, so each of those funders that are funding specific elements of it, they can't dictate what you're doing with other people's funding because it's none of their business. So core grant day doesn't mean you stop all other avenues of funding. It just means that you have to tick the box and jump through the hoops that they want you to jump through, but you can jump through other hoops for other people if you want as well. Fundraising, again, we were discussing this a lot in the financial planning workshop. Very, very important. You need to have a fundraising strategy. Again, back to strategic planning. One thing you have to plan is your fundraising. You need to think about that. How are you going to do it? When are you going to do it? Who's going to do it? What's the return and our time do we put into it? Really important. Online fundraising, people weren't even thinking about this 3 years ago. Some groups were, they were maximizing their online fundraising. 99% of groups weren't even looking at it. Then COVID hit. You couldn't do the fashion show, you couldn't do the bake sale, you couldn't do the annual church day collection, you couldn't do the backpacking because we're all isolated. You couldn't fundraise from your house. And then people realized, actually, we can. If we go online, we can fundraise. We can target people that are at home, that are bored, who are on social media constantly. We can now tap into them and get more money off them. We can tap into people who don't live in the community, who won't be in Dunn stores to give us money for the backpacking, who won't be outside Churchgate, who are living in Timbuktu, who can now get involved in the community because they're online. If you look at the toy show last year, it generated something like 6.5 million euros for children's charities in Ireland. Why? Because people were at home, they couldn't get involved in projects, they had disposable income. It was very simple to send a text or go online and donate money. And they just ramped it up. They raised massive amount of money last year because people had time. They want to get involved, they couldn't get involved, and it was a way of getting involved. What people should do after COVID's long gone, whenever that's going to be, this is the way forward. You can maximize your money you can raise online way easier than doing your traditional fundraising. There's an awful lot less work involved in an online fundraising campaign. Again, you can do that through your own website. You can use third-party online fundraising platforms like GoFundMe, for example, or mycharity.ie or whatever it might be. But again, have a strategy around these two, okay? Sponsors and partners. Your sponsors are people that will sponsor one-off events, one-off things, like your sponsor for your local golf classic, your sponsor for your local event, whatever it might be. Partners are what we look at. They're longer term. These are people who have chosen you as their charity partner. Try to tie them into 3-year deals where they're giving you a certain amount of money per year for 3 years. At the end of the 3 years, going back to looking for another 3 years, or you're moving on to a different partner. You don't want that many partners because they won't want to get involved because it's kind of diluted. They want to get involved where there's not loads of other companies and corporate partners involved. Some partners don't want any publicity out of it. Most partners will want some sort of marketing return out of it. With the partners, they should get a lot more exposure, recognition than the sponsors, because the sponsors come in on a lower level. Okay. The other reason why a corporation will want to get involved as a partner is because they can now close the door to other charities, saying we've already chosen our charity for next year is, a cancer support agency, for example, a children's charity, a mental health charity. They're a chosen charity for the next year. Sorry, we'll come back to this in a year's time and we'll look at your proposition. Donors, people who donate money to you. Philanthropy, the various different philanthropic organizations out there that you can look at as well in terms of look at their criteria, their guidelines, what they fund, what they don't fund. Are they specifically related to a geographic area or a specific type of cause? Most of them are. They're either linked to a specific cause or they're linked to a local area. Then your social loans. Your loans from social banks. So your 2 social banks in Ireland are Clan-Credo and Community Finance Ireland. They're different than a commercial bank on the basis that you have to pay off the loan and pay them back. But the one key thing with them is they're focused on lending to community-based projects, social projects. There has to be a social objective. Okay, you have to accompany them by guarantee structure or a not-for-profit structure. there's got to be no profit sharing, no dividends given out. One of the key things with social loans as opposed to commercial loans is they won't look for guarantees from directors, which is really important. So if you're a director of a company limited by guarantee, and you're asked to be a guarantor on a loan, that's not a good place to be, because now they're going to come to you if the loan's not paid off. Clan Creed or Community Finance Ireland won't look for that. They won't look for guarantees on the loans. Their interest rates they're similar enough to the commercial banks. They do a fast turnaround time, well, fast-ish, and they do a specific type of loans that will provide bridging loans for, say, leader funding, or bridging loans for, say, like sports capital funding. Okay. The good thing about Clan Credo is that the person that's responsible for this region is living in Kerry. She lives in Causeway. Her name is Sarah Leahy, and Sarah's ex-AIB. I've worked with Sarah on a lot of different projects. Very, very good. But the fact that she's local, she understands the local scene here. She knows the projects. She knows the areas. So you're not trying to explain to someone outside of Kerry about your community, what you're doing and what you're not doing. Commercial loans are open to you as well. So your credit union loans, bank loans. Banks are slow enough to give out lending to not-for-profit organizations because there's no guaranteed income or loan repayment capacity. Credit unions, because they're social banks, they're not social banks, they're social enterprises, they're community-owned banks. They have a remit of giving out community funds. The Credit Union Tralee, Car Credit Union, has the Laura Healy grant scheme as well. So they give out grants to community groups, things up to €3,000 to give out in grant aid to groups as well. So they have a kind of I suppose, a stake within the community. So a lot of groups go to them looking for funding as well. And they will look at it, but also the banks will as well. And I said in-kind contributions as well. So this is areas where you're not looking for money, you're looking for support. So voluntary labour, a big one. I know a lot of projects that would have got, say, playground projects, site works would be done by local contractors that have machinery. They would then do all the site works for nothing. I know of paint companies that give out paint for free to local groups for painting projects. Garden companies giving out bedding plants for projects locally. Sometimes they do it because they want to do it, but if they don't, or if they're not asked, they won't do it. So ask them, get equipment for free, ask people to donate equipment, go to companies, if you're looking for electrical equipment, like say stuff for kitchens or whatever in your centres, ask Harvey Norman, Sound Store, all of them, go to all of them and play them all off each other. Say, I got one thing from one person, the other thing from another person, just play them. But definitely the labour one is a big one. That can save you a lot of money if you've got voluntary labour coming in. And a lot of grant applications like leader funding, you're allowed to actually include the voluntary labour as matching funds. So you're given a schedule, a timesheet, and you're given a rate per day that you can claim for voluntary labour. So if someone's coming in doing, say, block work for you, or painting, or electrical work, or plumbing, or whatever, on a voluntary basis, you can actually claim their time and the value as matching funds against the grant. So it's you get it in. Not only are you getting the work done for free, you're also getting a monetary value out of it coming back to you as well. So we're looking into it. Okay. The next thing then when we look at in terms of the strategic planning and the action planning. So you've gone from putting the plan in place, the actions in place. You've now looked at the implementation, the structure, the funding. That's all very, very good. You're now actually implementing a project. You're out there doing what you're supposed to do. The actions are happening. Things are working. Now you need to evaluate it. So the key thing with every project, doesn't matter how small it is, you evaluate it. And you evaluate it for two reasons. One is because you have to, because you're told by the funders you have to evaluate this project and come back and tell us what you did and what you didn't do. Secondly, if you don't evaluate what you've done and ask questions, what do we do good? What do we do so good? Where do we need to improve? How can we improve? You won't improve on things. So we evaluate what we do to improve. That's what we do the whole time. Okay. So what would be evaluated in terms of the project? Who needs to be involved? In other words, who do you ask in terms of, well, was this, no. So if you do a project and you're looking at the social impact, you ask them what the impact was. How did this project change your life? How did it improve your well-being? Well, it doesn't matter what it is. We asked a guy I'll never forget it, in Charleville. We did an evaluation of the Duhallow area rural transport, DART, the rural transport project, about probably 10 years ago, I say. And we did a focus group of people, and we went to a daycare centre And we asked these people randomly that were getting the bus service, like, what does a bus service mean to them? Very simple question. What does a bus service mean to you? And we had this guy, he was a bachelor living on his own in a farmhouse about 15 miles outside of Charleville somewhere in the middle of nowhere. And because he told me he lived in the middle of nowhere. And he told me about his life. And I asked him, what does this transport mean to you? And he says, to be honest, he said, if this transport wasn't here, I'd be dead. So that's impactful. Like that's I wrote that down word for word. You don't talk about value for money. You don't talk about anything else to that. This guy would not be alive. He said, I wouldn't have survived. He was suffering from depression. He said he was in and out of institutions because of that. And that he was at breaking point until this 1 day a week, which was only 1 day a week, access to a service was his lifeline. That's what he lived for every week. That 1 day a week is what he lived for. Right? That's hugely important. Now, a civil servant or a person that's analysing numbers might say, well, there's 2 people on the bus. That's not value for money. Scrap that service. €1,000 a day, roughly, it is to keep someone in care. So that's $7,000 a week, as opposed to providing maybe a couple €100 to keep this guy on a bus once a week. That's what we talk about evaluation. So what needs to be evaluated? Who needs to be involved? How do you do it? Surveys, focus groups, interviews, evaluation cards, common cards, whatever. Does it need to be done externally or internally? Can you do the evaluation yourself? Absolutely, you can do it yourself. If it's funded, and you have to get an external evaluator to do it because it has to be independent and it has to be objective, that's fine. But do your own evaluations. There's no point having Tom O'Leary telling you what's good or bad. You need to find out yourselves. Because it's my interpretation of this. If I evaluate, I'll say, I don't think this is good or this is good. You need to know yourselves what the problems are. Okay? Like, as I always say, for businesses, if you've got a restaurant, you want to find out, as a restaurant owner, if there's a problem with the food, not the person's talking next day, telling them there's a problem with the food, because you can't do anything about it at that stage. Okay? You need to be able to do this. You need to do the evaluations to fix problems when they're there, but also look at how we can improve next time around. When do you do the evaluation? Don't wait to the very end. You need to be doing it ongoing, because if there's something wrong during the process, you need to be able to fix it. I remember we did a project above in, I won't say where in West Limerick, but in West Limerick, a building project. The building was completed. Everything was paid out. And there was a major problem with the design. There was a huge design flaw within the building, within the project itself. That I'm not a builder or an engineer, but it was obvious to anyone there was a problem there. And they went through everything without being spotted, because there was no ongoing meetings with the builder, with the engineers, nothing. This wasn't spotted. It didn't mean that they lost their funding like that. It just meant that their building was stupid. It didn't work properly. This didn't make sense. And eventually, 3 years down the line, they started knocking walls to make it work better. Okay, because there was no ongoing monitoring of what was happening. And that's kind of a nuclear example, but you have to be constantly asking what's happening, what's going on. Can we change things? Do we need to change things? Are we on budget, for example? How do you communicate the results? Very important. If you're being funded locally by your community, you have to keep them up to date and involved, right? If you're not communicating with them, because human nature will think, why are they being so quiet about this money we're giving them? We don't see anything happening. We don't see any progress. We don't see anything, going on. You need to kind of tell them what's happening. Do you know those thermometer or fundraiser placards you see in villages? We're at now at €10,000. We're halfway there, sort of thing. That's kind of, then you say next week it's like €15,000. That gives people kind of, when they're doing something, they're actually raising some money. They're getting there. We're nearly at our target. And that's where social media is very important. Where you use social media to keep people up to date what's happening, and communicate with them. And then what will influence future planning? So what sorts of things do we need to evaluate that would help us with our plan next year? So at the end of 2022, this time next year, you'll be looking back over your plan for 2022 and say, okay, we could have done this better. We could have done this differently. For 2023, might change things slightly here. Okay. If you don't do that, nothing's going to improve. Nothing's going to get better. The last thing I want to talk to you about is risk management. Okay, this is standard risk management policy that I've lifted from Pubble. Okay, what I tend to use is I look at the compliance and the requirements of large-scale funded projects. So community services projects being the biggest one probably, right? And if you can comply with those sort of criteria, you're compliant with everything. Now, I haven't got on with Pobble a lot over years. I've had rows of them, but one thing they have is they do give you kind of rock solid, criteria to follow, that you have to follow, and procedures you have to follow. And if you don't follow them, you're in trouble. Some people don't like that because they feel it's kind of too much bureaucracy, too much administration, too much pressure on groups, whatever it might be. But it does give you some baseline kind of criteria to follow for any project. So there's a couple things I look at. Risk management and how you manage this risk. Now, you got all these risk management templates and stuff. Don't worry too much about that, okay? Just understand in terms of there's a couple of things you need to look at, or a few things within your organizations you need to look at that you need to prevent, okay? So compliance risk is number one. And basically this is, where you run into problems where you're not compliant with regulations. So not doing returns to revenue, not doing returns to the charity regulator, not doing returns to your funders, just basically not compliant, where it's now going to cause you problems with funding or potentially with penalties down the line. Okay, very, very important. Things like health and safety, insurance, employment law, they're it's common sense, but again, because people are working for not-for-profit, voluntary run organizations, they feel that, well, it doesn't impact on us. It's for larger companies. It's not our problem. It is. You have to be compliant. If you feel that you're not compliant, this is where you do your review of your policies and procedures, making sure that, yes, we've ticked all the boxes here, we're compliant in all things we need to be compliant on. External risk, this is really important as well. It's where you're at risk of becoming irrelevant. In other words, the groups around you that you're dealing with, whether it be local community, whether it be funding organizations, they just feel that you're not moving kind of with the times. You're not relevant anymore to them, and there's other groups coming in that are just better than you. Okay, and that's really something that's kind of hard for some groups to accept. But some groups come to me and say, okay, we've seen a drop down in numbers coming to us. We've seen X, Y, or Z. And it might be just because they're just they haven't improved their services, they haven't improved their facilities, they haven't done anything in years. There's the same people involved. They just become irrelevant anymore. The organizations that are supporting us move on to the kind of the flagship organization that's after moving in, and they move on to them. Communities get bored and say, well, they're doing the exact same thing year in, year out, and they're constantly looking for money off us. That's a problem. Reputation is a problem. Financial risk, again, fraud's big extreme. Financial failure, bad decisions being made. Or just inaccurate information systems. So some organizations don't have skilled administrators involved. They don't have good accountants that are kind of monitoring them or putting good systems and procedures in place. And financially, they're a mess. Right? They're just bad record keeping, bad bookkeeping. They're behind in returns, behind in the reporting. They don't have good budgeting systems in place. They just there's no financial committee there that's got any sort of oversight. And they're at financial risk of going under. Huge issue with an awful lot of organizations because they don't have the skilled people in place. That's where you need to get them on board. You need to have some person, at least one person on the board that understands finances and financial reports. Governance risk, again, massive issue with every organization, not a lot of organizations, just poor decision making, ineffective oversight. Again, really important that there's a good governance in place. If there's not, there's huge issues and huge risks involved. That's linked to the compliance risk as well, by the way. The last one is IT risk. This was unheard of 20 years ago. Okay, GDPR in terms of your information, your databases, your online accounts, your social media platforms, your cloud servers where your information is stored, your laptops, your phones, all this is hugely important. A lot of organizations in the community sector are dealing with sensitive data. Okay, that has to be protected. It's very, very important that if you're not up to date with your GDPR policies, that you get up to date with them. It's a massive issue at the moment with everyone online and with Zoom. And no one's really looking at it as being an issue. It's something that you need to address in terms of people working remotely. Is a massive issue. It's not being brought up, and I haven't seen it come up anywhere in discussion yet. I don't know why it hasn't. But if you've got, say, 15, 20 people working for an organization working remotely from home, and they're all using their own broadband at home. There's no, like, if you're working for an organization, there's firewalls in place, there's IT people in place, IT departments in place in a lot of cases. There's structures in there to prevent stuff from going wrong. If you're working from a laptop at home with insecure broadband, that's an issue if you've got sensitive information on your laptops or whatever, or you're sharing information by email or through cloud or even through Zoom and stuff as well. Operational risk, again, this is probably one that if you're at risk of this, then you got a serious problem. This is where you're providing bad services. There's issues with the operations, there's issues with the organization, the way it's run, the service being provided, facilities being provided. These kind of your organizations that are shut down by the funders, that are under investigation, that there's lawsuits, there's every sort of problems with them because they just don't evaluate, they don't monitor the delivery of their service because there is no structure in place to do it. Reputation risk, as I said earlier on, and again, huge issue with the community volunteer sector. We all like to get involved in charities, we all like to get involved in not-for-profit organizations, but there's been a lot of scandals within the charitable sector over the years. People have lost faith in it. That's why the regulator was brought in. There's also, because you're dealing with so many different people, volunteers, different people that are linked with the organization, all it takes is one or two people to be kind of disgruntled by something within the organization. They start going out bad mouthing against people, spreading gossip, spreading rumor, that becomes reality. Perception becomes reality, and it creates major problems when it comes to reputation. Huge amount of problems. That raises issues then when it comes to difficulty to raise funds and where you're trying to get volunteers involved. No one is going to get involved in an organization that's got question marks over it in terms of governance or reputation. A funder is not going to get involved. A private company is certainly not going to get involved in sponsorship. I know you saw there the Formula One Mercedes there last week pulled their sponsorship deal with Kingspan because they're linked to the big fire in the tower in England there a couple of years back. That's a big example of it, but I've seen lots of examples where local companies have pulled their sponsorship of projects because they don't trust the groups that they're sponsoring. And then strategic risk, which ties back into what we're talking about last 2 weeks. You do not develop strategies that are unrealistic. Don't go after objectives and goals that are just completely unrealistic, that can never get achieved. Because what happens is they lead to failure. You just constantly fail, and constant failure is, just soul destroying for the people involved. It also just shows the people externally that you're trying to get support from, that these guys have no idea what they're at. Okay. So like if you're playing for, sorry if anyone here from Leitrim, but if you're from Leitrim, you're playing GA football for Leitrim, you're not going to say we're going to win the All-Ireland every year. Like, it's not going to do it. It's not achievable. So don't set a target that's not achievable. Be realistic. Start off small. Go for stuff that you're going to achieve and do and complete, and get some wins on board. Get momentum behind it. Get people behind you. Get goodwill behind you. Get a good track record behind you. Okay, and then start building it. But always keep to the level that you can. Don't go beyond the level that you feel that we're now in danger zone here. Okay, stay at a level that you're comfortable with. Okay, that's really important. Some organizations, they don't want to expand and develop and grow because they're comfortable where they're at, and they're sure of where they're at, and they're safe where they're at. That's fine. Other organizations want to expand and grow and grow and grow, and they grow too big and it just explodes around them. So just be very careful that your strategy, that you're not at risk of going down the wrong road with your strategy. Very important. If you do the assessment, as we talked last week, sit down and think through logically what you're supposed to do. You should avoid that. Okay, so that's pretty much strategic planning. As I said, the templates I sent you out last week, the word template, the strategic planning template, use that. The more important thing to use is that Excel's planning template. To me, that is kind of go-to for everything we do in terms of projects. Whether it be my own projects in terms of my own company, that keeps me on track in terms of what I'm supposed to be doing, or working with groups I'm working with in terms of keeping them on track. Very, very important. It's a one-pager, but it will keep you focused. It will keep you running efficiently. It will allow you to delegate as well, and will allow you kind of assign budgets to various different projects. Have you any questions on what we discussed this evening? Does it make sense to you? Yeah?
Yeah, no, it was good. Just as always, a lot of information.
Yeah, no, it is, and I would recommend to go back. Like, I know this has been recorded, to go back over it if you've trouble sleeping, but to go back over it and just scroll through it and pick out kind of parts of it, because it is just kind of step to step. There is a slides there as well, but I said, like, don't, if you feel that you're kind of struggling with this in terms of going forward, in terms of using what I'm giving you, I said, feel free to email me and say, Tom, we're struggling with this. Where do we go here? Okay, because like, it's just maybe simple email back to you in terms of, this is what you need to do or not do. Keep it simple. Don't overcomplicate it. Now, that template I sent out, the Excel spreadsheet, Excel work plan template, is straightforward enough to use. If you don't worry about the word plan template unless you're actually writing a strategic plan to show someone else. Your strategic plan really is the work plan. The action plan is the key. That's where everything's focused on.
Would you keep that work plan to just a year at a time, or would you have one for a 3-year one as well?
You have both. So you'd have, let's say if you're doing a 3-year strategic plan or 5-year strategic plan, you'd have an overall 3-year plan. So your timelines would be, say, quarter 4 2022, right? So it's kind of more kind of out there timelines. Within each of those actions, then you'd have a specific action plan for it. So let's say in your overall 3-year plan, the first part that might be, look, we're going. So I'll give an example of it, a really quick example. ASDE Community Development Association did their community plan about 2 years ago. Within their action, about maybe three page of actions they were going to do over the next 5 years, right? One of those actions was to look at developing a community, renovating or building a new community centre. Okay, so they took that action out, and they're now running with that action. So we're doing the feasibility study for them. They've got an action plan for that specific project. Okay, they also looked at the next action, which was developing a river walk trail and a recreational park in the village. That was the next project. They took that out and set up a specific project plan for that project. Does that make sense? So you've an overarching kind of, this is where we want to go over the next 5 years, and these are things we need to do. But within all those actions, there's a specific project plan for it. And even within that, there might be a further breakdown of that plan further. Does that make sense? Great, okay.
And I just want to thank everybody for coming as well. And thanks very much, Tom. I mean, as always, there was just such fantastic information there. And just to remind people as well, is that we have a financial planning session next week. It's a 2-hour session. And there's an option of Tuesday the 14th between 10 and 12, or we have a Wednesday evening between 7 and 9. So it might be well worth your while to follow on with the next session of financial planning.
Okay. Yeah. Very good. Great stuff. So hopefully see you next week, mostly. If not, have a good Christmas. And we might see you on the courses in January and February and March. I think it's going to March, Caroline, isn't it? Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Wish you luck for next year. Yeah. So and stay safe, and we'll talk to you soon.
Lovely.
Thanks, Caroline.
Thank you all very much. Take care.
Bye. Bye.